Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy, and science.
Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a privilege to have this opportunity to speak with all of you about my book, How to Save Politics in a Post-Truth Era. When we were first discussing hosting or inviting me to speak at this event, it was planned very, very far in advance. And I was wondering, so what are the odds that we would still be in a post-truth era? And I would say we still are, and it doesn't look like we're going to be leaving one anytime soon. That being the case, there's also nothing necessarily that new about living in a post-truth era. And I was recently in Austria, and they had a very interesting exhibit at a museum there in Vienna. This exhibit was about a set of forgeries produced by Rudolf IV in the 14th century. And Rudolf wanted to create a whole new reality. He wasn't satisfied with his title of Duke, so he created a new one, Archduke. He wasn't satisfied with the status of his family, and he created a bunch of iconography, statues that represented himself in a more imperial light, if you will. These forgeries were intended to change the reality so that his successors could eventually ascend to the throne of empire. And he submitted these forgeries to the Emperor Charles IV. So this is the 14th century. What do you think Charles IV did? Well, he had them fact-checked. This is what interested me, that apparently they did this in the 14th century, and he sent them to Petrarch, the humanist, and a few others to see, well, are these documents real? And they came back and they told Charles IV, these documents are forgeries, and they're really, really bad ones. You'd have to be a fool to fall for these forgeries. Nevertheless, Charles did not want to embarrass his son-in-law, so he accepted elements within these documents, and 100 years after Rudolf died, what he wanted came to pass, and these forgeries were codified into imperial law, and his successors eventually ascended to the throne of emperor. What Rudolf IV knew, along with many politicians today, is that to a very large extent, whatever reality you want to be the case can be produced. So when Kellyanne Conway, the White House spokesperson, went on Meet the Press on NBC in the United States and said that there are quote-unquote alternative facts, she was saying that whatever the White House wants to be true is true regardless of any evidence to the contrary. When Michael Gove in this country during the referendum said that we've had enough of experts, he was making a populist plea against elite knowledge like mine in favor of a more authentic, everyday, sort of common person knowledge. And I've always found that argument from him to be rather ironic. I learned from Gordon Brown, who was speaking in Newcastle during the referendum, that maybe the only thing that Gove has ever really, really worked hard on in his life was losing his Scottish accent. So there's nothing local or authentic about him, at least not in the way he speaks. Post-truth politics is largely about producing a reality where evidence doesn't matter and where everything is based on a kind of identity claim. And what I want to do in today's talk, we've got about 25 minutes or so, is I want to outline some of the philosophy behind how that post-truth discourse functions. Why is it that alternative facts, if you will, have currency? To do so, I'm going to talk a little bit about science and the scientific method. I also want to talk about how we save politics. Now, I'm a political or international political theorist. I'm a theorist. I'm not a policy person. What interests me are the ways in which we think about these ideas and how we make sense out of them and how we then develop, if you will, moral or normative or ethical responses to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to develop an argument about the significance of political responsibility, an argument that's focused on a particular reading of our identity, a very general reading in a sense, but an important one. What I want to argue, in a sense, is that we need to be comfortable with uncertainty. That what we know is never only our own, it's always other people's. And as a consequence of that, we have a responsibility to each other and even to people and places that we may not know, may not have been to. So I want to start about I want to start with science, because why not? Post-truth politics, in a way, reflects an ongoing debate about relativism. Whatever you say is true, regardless of any evidence to the contrary. This is not a new debate. I don't have to go back as the 14th century, fortunately. I can go back to the 1990s. In the 1990s, there was a fairly significant academic debate in what was called the science wars. The science wars was a largely intellectual, but also political debate about how certain types of knowledge are undermining our ability to identify evidence in the world. So as a theorist, I would be potentially accused of just writing a bunch of mumbo-jumbo gibberish. It's all jargon. It's just nonsense. What you really need is ability to identify hard facts. And in being able to identify hard facts, you can identify inequalities, and you can identify injustices, and you can possibly at the same time also identify the causes of these inequalities and injustices, thereby being able to overcome them. Now, what these arguments meant was that there is only one way in which we can know the world. And one of the most famous academics, scholars, public intellectuals who was involved in these debates was a physicist. His view was that there is only one way to produce knowledge, and it's the type of way, or it's the method that you take from the natural sciences, from physics. So you identify causes and effect, right? There's an empirical world out there that you can study, and anything else is nonsense. Now, the problem with those arguments was that it ignored something very important that most of us experience all the time. And one of the reasons I wanted to return to the 1990s is that a lot of the work that I do is actually inspired and influenced by the types of people that those arguments were attacking. So in my book, I discuss this at length. What arguments that are focused on being able to identify facts, hard evidence, what those arguments miss is that most of us, when we encounter scientific knowledge, unless you're an academic and you deal with it all the time in your profession, when most of us encounter it, we're doing so through public debates, the news media, right? Maybe various forms like this, I don't know. But what happens is that we are regularly encountered with new and competing claims. So for example, if you think about diet or healthcare, every other week there's some new study that tells you what you previously thought was true is now no longer true. A food that is really good for you one week becomes next week the cause of cancer and gangrene and who knows what. What we think is healthy, the next week is going to kill you. And these kind of stories happen all the time. And they don't just happen with diet or healthcare. They happen in politics as well, right? With polling data. That one week with polls tell us one thing, the next week they tell us something else. And what this seems to suggest, in public at least, is that a fact is only as good until the next one comes along. Hence, when Kellyanne Conway says there are alternative facts, she is feeding into people's willingness to accept that claims regularly change, and as a consequence of that, whatever claim is being advocated might be true, but tomorrow it might not. So how do you decide which claims you're going to accept? Think about the inauguration with President Trump. Greatest number ever. Well, that was nonsense. There was photographic evidence to demonstrate that, but it didn't matter. Or if we stick to the United States for a minute, if we think about other examples, there was an individual who drove 350 miles, heavily armed, to a pizza parlor in the Washington, D.C. area so he could liberate children who he thought were being held captive as part of a pedophile ring in the pizzeria's basement, with his pedophile ring being run by Hillary Clinton. Obviously, Hillary Clinton was not running a pedophile ring, and if anybody's interested, the pizzeria also doesn't have a basement. Fortunately, nobody was killed in that incident, but he did go heavily armed, and he did discharge his weapon, I believe. And these are not isolated. We have there's very similar types of deceits that happen here. An easy example is the debate about passport covers in the referendum. There is no EU law that says what color British passports, UK passports have to be. So when someone says we're getting our nation back, we're getting our country back, and they I don't know what color, I think it would be a blue passport, you could have done it all along. So there's all sorts of examples in which you basically make a claim, and then how do you decide which one you're going to believe? And what seems to work here, it's not what claim is being said that matters. It's who's saying it that counts. And once you identify the who, as opposed to the what, and I feel that there should now be a band called The What, since I've just referenced the who. I should get a royalty for that. Once we recognize that it's who that says something as opposed to what, then we're no longer dealing with evidence anymore. We're dealing with identity-based claims over which identities you are most likely to identify with, and as a consequence, which narratives you are most likely to understand, which narratives make the most sense to you, because who we are is bound up about our stories of ourselves, where we find ourselves in the world, what stories make sense to us, what people we identify with. The stakes here are very, very high. I want to read a quote from Evelyn Fox, who was writing around the time of, I believe in the 1990s, and she said, if truth is relative, if science is divorced from nature and married instead to culture, then the privileged status of that authority, so the status of science, is fundamentally undermined. So the stakes here are very, very high. We're not just talking about our political futures here. We're also talking about our ability to know the world itself. So when we constantly find evidence being undermined or dismissed, we're actually making two different types of attacks. One is an attack on what sort of knowledge we value. The second is an attack on those people who don't share the same belief systems that we do and are not ready to accept the types of claims that we are. So I said I want to talk about identity and responsibility. How do we make this move from what I've been speaking about, science and the science wars, and how do we make that move to identity? Well, we do so by recognizing a philosophical argument that what we know about the world is never only our own. So an example of this would be how we don't encounter a world that is empty or divorced of meaning. We don't just walk around and that there's just emptiness around us. The world is a world of meaning, and it's already meaningful as we walk through it. When you go into a room like this one, you have some sense of what this room means, where you're supposed to sit. I'm sitting up here, you're all sitting over there. No one has to tell you that. It's not as if you're being ushered, right? Or people think, I don't want to sit in the chair, I'm going to stand on a table. We know what these spaces mean and how you interact with them. And nobody's having to tell you that. If you go into a museum and you see or an art gallery and you see a painting, most likely you see something else than just squiggly lines and colors. That you're able to take some story, some meaning from that painting. Not only that, other people are able to do the same thing, and they might even interpret the same stories or the same meanings from that painting. They might come up with a completely different interpretation, but you can still have a conversation about it. That you are able to communicate, to understand in some way how that image is telling you different things. Our lives and our political practices effectively reflect that same process. That there's a world around there that is full of meaning, and we don't just produce it from in here, from in our minds. If it was only in our minds, then we get into crazy philosophical territory, which no one really takes seriously. The world is meaningful because other people also participate in a world of meaning. They help us understand the world that we find ourselves in. So what you know is always a part of those interactions with other people, with other places, with other objects, with other cultures. It's never just yours. Who you are is always bound up in those encounters. You cannot divorce yourself from the world you find yourselves in. So this example I gave about this guy who drove to this pizzeria, he lived in a world which is very, very insular. How did he decide that there was this pedophile ring going on in Comet Ping Pong Pizza? Well, he was first told about it by people he knew. It was word of mouth. So people he knew, right? Remember that identity, that you're ready to believe what certain people tell you. He then did research, or what he thought was research. He bought an internet connection, and he started binge watching YouTube videos and internet conspiracy websites. And in the process of reading these websites, which would link to other websites, he came to the conclusion that there's a multiplicity of sources confirming this pedophile ring, therefore it must be real. And he felt a responsibility. He still felt connected in a way to this world. He felt, I need to go and save these children. He really meant to go and do good. But I think most of us would recognize that this is crazy, and it was also very dangerous to the people at the pizzeria, and it also created all sorts of other problems for the owners and the employees at the pizzeria. This is a very insular, narrow world, and you can think about it in terms of extreme partisanship, right? You only listen to what's on Fox News, for example, or pick your tabloid in this country. It's a world where everything is already, in a way, comfortable. Even if it's disturbing, it's something that you are prepared to accept. That no matter how outrageous the claim, it somehow fits with your view of what is possible. But it's a very, very narrow view of what is possible, one shaped by extreme exclusions of pretty much anybody who doesn't fit into your existing narrative. Debates about immigrants feature in the exact same way. I'm an immigrant. You can probably tell from my accent. I'm not from here. I certainly don't sound like it. There's certainly a lot of foods here that I'm not particularly interested in eating. That might not just be me, I don't know. I can't comment. The referendum in this country was against people like me. It was an anti-immigrant campaign, explicitly acknowledged so by many of the politicians at the time and afterwards, who said that was the only way we could win, was by making an anti-immigrant campaign. What's the synergy here? What's the connection? What I was saying earlier about identity, it's us versus them. Politics in a post-truth era is based on these zero-sum narratives, where your claims cannot coexist with the claims of others. It has to be your way, or it's no way at all. Hence the extreme politics, the extreme rhetoric that we hear, unfortunately, so much of the time. What I'm suggesting is that we have a political responsibility to the world we find ourselves in, because we wouldn't be who we are without this world. But it is a world that we don't always see. We don't always encounter it, right? We know of things that we've never experienced. That's part of what it is to be a human being. You can think about something, and yet you've never necessarily experienced it, right? There is this multiplicity of people, of cultures, of identities, of meanings, of foods, of practices out there in the world that you cannot ignore. And if you do ignore them, then the dangers are very, very real, right? These are the same kind of insular narratives that in the past led to the kind of politics that today we would refer to by such terms as authoritarian or totalitarian, not necessarily democratic. When I was writing the book, a big part of doing it was the need to respond to what I was seeing going on around me, and wanting to demonstrate that as someone who deals with theory, that I could make a case for how, as a theorist, we can respond to post-truth politics. And the blurb for today's talk says that I will consider how we as engaged citizens might think about and commit to politics in this post-truth era. Now, that's a very difficult question to answer, because all of us are going to have different commitments. We're going to have different things that we think take precedence. But what I find incredibly shocking about the political climate that we find ourselves in this country, and in many other countries around the industrial world and also now in Brazil, is what appears to be the complete absence of any meaningful political responsibility from politics. That effectively so many of our politicians do not appear to be invested in acting responsibly. They appear to be invested in themselves, in their own career, anything but what you could refer to as the national interest. That explains the referendum, which is incredibly divisive. I mean, the margins are very, very small, right? And it was never a referendum about the national interest. It was a referendum about politics in the Conservative Party. That doesn't mean that Cameron maybe shouldn't have considered raising as referendum. But it's curious that if you have an issue that is only really of significance to trying to sustain your own status within a political party, that you can then take that debate and blow it up in such a way that it basically fractures the entire country, risks the unity of the United Kingdom, potentially risks bringing back the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and do so in a way, incidentally, that if the referendum was actually legally binding, wouldn't even be recognized because the campaign broke so many laws. The examples just keep going on and on and on. Keeping up with the pizza theme, we have the case of this ferry company that had no ferries and had taken their contract, I think, from a pizzeria or a pizza delivery chain. That fiasco is now going to cost us as taxpayers probably about, they're saying 33 million pounds? Yeah. That is not responsible. People ask me sometimes, I teach international relations, and people ask me, what is international relations? And I tell them that international relations as an academic subject is the field that tells us why there's always money for weapons in war and not for healthcare. It's disturbing, but it's actually kind of true. And what we see now is a similar type of phenomenon, where there appears to be incentives to do pretty much anything to sustain your own privileged status, as opposed to what could be, from a variety of different perspectives, in the national interest. Whether it's Boris Johnson doing whatever he thinks he is doing, or a good example here, which I'm going to end on and then just wrap up, is Cavanaugh in the United States. So Cavanaugh is Trump's Supreme Court nominee. He's now on the Supreme Court. And there are quite a lot of accusations directed towards him of fairly questionable nature. I'm not going to get into the specifics. What I want to focus on is how he defended himself when he was called to the Senate. And he displayed a very curious tactic. He was angry. He was really angry. He didn't respect the senators that were asking questions. He didn't do anything that would suggest that this is somebody who has the temperament that you would want to be on the Supreme Court. But he was rewarded for it. He was told by certain senators, you have a right to be angry. Why was he angry? Well, partially because I think what we saw is he felt his privilege and entitlement being threatened. And he was told, this is not, obviously he didn't tell me this, but there was reports that he was told that he should go in fighting. He shouldn't just go there and sit like Clarence Thomas did many, many years previously, that he should go in fighting. I find this bizarre. Not that there's individuals out there who are trying to protect their own privilege, but rather that we've entered a political climate where it's acceptable to act in ways which seemingly betray the temperament that you would expect of people in those offices. Now, how do we respond to these sorts of things? In the book, I talk a lot about how we need to save politics. What I mean by that is the necessity to bring political responsibility back into politics. And what I find most troubling about this is twofold, at least. One, debates about political responsibility are difficult because being responsible doesn't necessarily tell you the specifics what action to do. It gives you a normative or moral framework about what we expect. It's not a roadmap, right? There's judgment involved here. So you're still dealing with some questions over what would be in the national interest, what would it be to act responsibly. So there's a lot of work that we need to do as scholars and also as citizens, as committed, I think the phrase here is committed citizens, engaged citizens rather, to think about what do we consider to be politically responsible? What do we consider to be responsible conduct on the part of our politicians? One. Two, why is it that there appears to be a large number of elected officials who don't really appear to care about political responsibility? That if anything, their career is to be a politician. And that's curious in countries like the United Kingdom. So I'm Canadian, same political system. If this is in France or Germany, I would expect a bit of that because of how the education system there works and how you rise into a political or public office. But in Canada, you get into public office usually having been a successful lawyer or business person. You most likely have studied political science and then often gone into law. That's fairly common. Neither of those are necessarily skills that would set you up to be a successful politician. They set you up as skills to be a successful business person. They're not necessarily the same thing. Here, it's a bit different, but what you find instead appears to be, again, a form of class entitlement. And it doesn't matter here, this isn't just necessarily about which political party you belong to. That there are very clear channels in which people, and a lot of them I think are my students, very clear channels in which you end up opening the doors that get you into these offices. And they don't necessarily seem to be the channels that are bringing people into politics that we would always necessarily want. And I think that's a very interesting question as engaged citizens. What is the political culture that we contribute to that somehow enables this kind of politics to function? Because all of us, in some sense, are responsible for the politics that we have around us. And I say that, this is what I want to end on, because being responsible doesn't mean that you have always caused something. We tend to think of responsibility as having a causal dynamic, right? If you think of law, you do the crime, you do the time, that you're accountable for what you did. But there's other kinds of responsibility which are not causal. They come from simply belonging to a society made up of a lot of different people, a lot of different languages, cultures, religions, practices, and that somehow we have a responsibility at large to that greater community in which we live in. You just have to decide where the borders, where the boundaries of that community are. So to conclude, what I try to get across in the book is that political responsibility is absent from our post-truth political era. That identity is really, really important in sustaining post-truth politics, but it's also really important for overcoming it. And that in order to overcome it, we need to recognize just how important narratives are, because that tells us in many ways which groups of people or which identity claims or which person you're going to listen to. And finally, that we need to be comfortable with uncertainty. A politics of certainty is a politics that is very dangerous. Politics of certainty is the politics that leads to what we used to call, or what we used to call authoritarianism or totalitarianism. Democracy is not supposed to be a politics of certainty. It can't be, because there's always going to be difference, there's always going to be diversity, there's always going to be plurality, and whatever world we want to live in, we have to be comfortable with that, because if we're not, the alternative is very, very scary. Thank you very much.